Hello class, let's talk about sort of a gross anatomy of the action potential in the axon. So here we have our cross-section of our squid axon, very simplified here. And we know that at resting, right, our axon has a resting membrane potential of around -65. And this potential lines up right at the membrane. So the difference in charge is strongest right at the membrane here. See, it's negative on the inside and positive on the outside. So we have this electrostatic gradient, right, which is driven by both the changes in differences in concentrations of multiple ions that we've discussed before. And so let's see what happens here. So first we need some kind of stimulus, and we're experimenting here. So we do our little microelectrode, we stick it in our neuron, and we pump in just an itty bitty little bit of charge to it. And we're pumping in a positive charge because we want to depolarize the axon. And so what this does is that we sort of initiate just a little bit to get it to that -55 threshold. Right, so it's still negative on the inside, but we're just going to push it just a little bit. And then something magical happens. Localized in the area where we've depolarized the membrane just a titch, all of a sudden, sodium channels open up. And as we know, there is way more sodium on the outside of the cell than on the inside of the cell. So, no surprise, because sodium wants to get into the cell, driven by diffusion, because it's much more concentrated on the outside than it is on the inside. And also, the electrostatic force. I mean, look, we're lining up with positive sodium with a positive charge on the outside here. It wants to get sucked in to where it's negative because opposites attract when it comes to our electrostatic force. And indeed, these little channels that are perfect for sodium ions to travel through, they flood in. And what that does is creates a little local depolarization. And in this instant, right when this is happening, the rest of the axon is our normal -65. But in this little area, things are quickly depolarizing. And what does a bunch of sodium atoms want to do when they flood into this little space, creating it positive? Well, first, they're going to be repelled away from each other because of concentration gradient. And because of charge, they're going to escape their localized positive charge and go towards the negative axon, the rest of the axon, which is more negative. And so what happens is that it floods further down the axon. And so what does that do to the rest of the axon? Well, it acts just like what we did with this. Our electrode pumping in a little positive charge. These sodiums are pumping in a little positive charge. And if it's enough to get them from -65 to positive, or -65 to -55, well then, the same thing that happened here is going to happen here, further down. These sodium channels are going to flood. And this time, instead of the electrode doing it, it's our influx of sodium ions that are coming in from these channels because of the local depolarization. And so these open up. and sodium floods in. And you can see that chain reaction continuing down the axon. So because of this, in this movement, sodium repelling away from their localized depolarized area, moving towards the negative charge, moving away from their localized high concentration, right? Because we've got now tons of little sodium ions floating in this little immediate space where the channels are. We get a depolarizing current. And it flows down the axon. Now we know that this depolarization is transient, right? We know that if you take a look at your action potential, where is my action potential? Take a look at our action potential. It doesn't last very long. It's a little spike and then it disappears again. And then we eventually get back to our resting membrane potential. So the depolarizing current doesn't last very long, but it does flow down the axon. So why doesn't it last very long? Even though it's sort of carrying this localized depolarizing charge that just moves down the axon. So let's go back upstream to our original site and see what's happening. Now, after a short period of time, what happens is our sodium channels close. And so sodium upstream can no longer get in. Okay, that's great. So it can no longer continue to depolarize, but we've depolarized. So why doesn't it just stay positive on the inside? Well, enter potassium. As we know from before, potassium is much more concentrated on the inside of our axon. So we've got lots of potassium floating around in here already. It was already here. Even before we entered our, we punctured the axon with our microelectrode. And so what happens when these close, potassium channels, they open. And because potassium is more concentrated on the inside and less on the outside, it's going to move down its concentration gradient and leave the axon, taking positive charge with it. So as it leaves, we should expect that action potential to repolarize down through the falling phase of the action potential, which is exactly what we see. So our sodium channels close and our potassium channels open. And this is what initiates and causes this falling action, this falling phase. So much so that so much potassium leaves that it actually undershoots and becomes hyperpolarized, more negative than its resting membrane potential. So as this depolarizing current flows down the axon, and as a result, the action potential moves down the axon, operating under the assumption that this depolarizing current is enough to get it past that threshold. If the depolarizing current, initially brings it to negative 56, that's not quite enough, and you won't get this depolarizing current that flows down the axon, and thus an action potential will not move down the axon. So this is how it propagates down. Now, Our axons, as we've talked about before, are quite leaky. Even though the sodium ions are moving down, the charge itself is quite leaky. So it eventually wears out as it goes down. So if we just relied on passive current from one area to make it all the way down to the end of the axon to communicate with another neuron, it would never make it. It needs these frequent pit stops along the way to bring in more sodium ions to help keep the current strong. So it's no longer a passive current. It's not a passive potential. It is our active current, our active potential. So let's take a look at some cool adaptations that natural selection has given us to help facilitate the propagation of these currents. And so we take a look at our simple, basic neuron here with a certain diameter. Sodium floods in, creating this current that moves down. As we know before, some of this current moves out. It eventually dissipates, and it will disappear if we don't have any other sodium channels open. So perhaps this was a current that just wasn't quite strong enough to make it. Well, we can help the propagation by expanding the diameter of our axon. So that our current occupies a larger volume. And so that ratio of the surface area, given the volume of the intracellular space, is such that there is less surface area for the amount of charge that's moving. And so it has better staying power because less charge leaks out because it's interacting, has less surface area to interact with, so it can actually move further. This is what we see in the squid axon. And they have really fat neurons, as we've discussed before, up to 1 millimeter in diameter. And so action potential speed for squid axon between 20 and 25 meters per second. Not too slow. Now, how about us? How about humans? Do we have any special adaptations? Indeed we do. Myelin sheaths. Our neurons are myelinated. Right, and so these here are our myelinated axons. And so, gosh, I'm not quite prepared for this. You're going to have to double check my spelling here on myelination. So, myelination, or myelinated axons. So these are essentially insulated with adipose tissue, which is fat. Squids don't have this. So typically, as we've talked about before, sodium comes in, causes a current, which kind of is actively dissipating, right? But we're constantly getting a recharge on the current because it goes down and it's enough to open up these sodium channels. So by the time it would have fizzled out, we actually get a little boost. So it comes in and leaks out again, but we're constantly getting this added current coming into the axon because it's necessary. If it were just a passive conductance, it would fizzle out, it would all leak out eventually. So constantly having to input more current into the system, right? And this is active conductance. So that opening the floodgates is active conductance. Now on our myelinated axon, we do have these localized sites of active conductance where sodium is brought in. But because of the myelination, it insulates. It prevents the charge from leaking out. It does leak out a little bit, but not nearly as much if it wasn't insulated. So we can go greater distances. We don't require as many sodium channels to keep the charge going, to supplement the charge. So we can go greater distances with what is termed passive current or passive conductance. Conductance, I believe. And so these areas right here between our myelinated sheaths are called the nodes of Ranvier. I think for the longest time I was calling them the nodes of Ranvier, just because I'd never heard anyone say it before, or at least I wasn't paying attention, but in fact it is the nodes of Ranvier. And so at these nodes is when we get a little supplementation of our conductance, right? So this would be an active conductance here and a passive conductance where it's myelinated. And so because going down, initiating this local depolarization, sodium channels opening, right, which is proteins that have to go through space and time to change their orientation. This is a lot slower than just the movement of a charge, the movement of electrons. And so this takes time, every little pit stop along the way of active conductance to supplement. You got to wait for the sodium to come in and juice up and recharge and keep going. So you've got a lot more of these little stops along the way compared to our myelinated sheaths, where it's just a little bit of active conductance to get you going, and then you can go a long distance without stopping, without having to open up any other protein channels to supplement the conductance. And so because of this, myelinated axons, their action potentials propagate much faster. All right, so we're talking about an order of magnitude faster than the squid axon, 250 meters per second. Pretty darn fast. Okay, when we come back for our third video, we are going to zoom in even closer. Take a look at these channels to see what they're doing during an action potential. During and after the action potential propagates down through the axon.